As you entertain the idea of transitioning out of your company and looking at an ESOP transaction, one of the very first things that any of us are going to ask you for is, what's your read on the future? Where do you think things are headed, and what makes you think that you're going to get there? Welcome back, everyone, to the Journey to an ESOP and Beyond podcast, where we seek to make all things related to employee stock ownership plans both accessible and understandable. I'm your co-host today, Jason Miller.
And I'm Makenzie Ragland.
And we are going to have fun talking about forecasting today.
Who doesn't love predicting the future?
I think that we would probably have better luck predicting the future when we have better luck predicting the weather. And I always like to joke around the meteorologists being wrong half the time, which means they're right half the time. But I don't have the same luxury in my life of being wrong so often. So this is going to be a fun topic for you to discuss, Makenzie, as we go through forecasting. Um, I think listeners, as you entertain the idea of transitioning out of your company and looking at an ESOP transaction, one of the very first things that any of us are going to ask you for is, what's your read on the future? Where do you think things are headed, and what makes you think that you're going to get there? So, Makenzie, tell us why this matters to our listeners when they're thinking about an ESOP transaction.
Yeah, so I think we often, when we speak to our clients and we bring up that a forecast is needed, I think it's sometimes we get responses that are like, "Oh yeah, I have that. We track that. We prepare one." Others have never, and they are like, "How can you expect me to come up with that?" We know that a forecast is never going to be exactly right. However, when you think about an ESOP transaction and you have your buyer, which is the ESOP trust represented by a trustee, what they're really purchasing is the future cash flows of the company. So they need to understand what the future cash flows of the company are projected to look like, since those cash flows will be paying off the debt that comes on as a result of the transaction.
Hmm.
And again, I think all parties involved, everyone realizes that a forecast is never going to be right. It's never going to be 100% accurate. However, that doesn't mean that you cannot come up with something that is reasonably right or reasonably accurate in terms of the assumptions that you are baking in when you build your forecast, to come up with something that can be reasonably right, we'll call it.
Why does that matter so much?
Well, you have a lot of people relying on it in the transaction, and it matters because, for example, in the typical process of determining whether an ESOP makes sense for your company is feasibility, and you need to figure out or determine whether it's feasible that your company can go through with an ESOP transaction and sustain any debt that gets taken on through future cash flows. Am I hitting what you're trying to hit?
Yeah, there's a lot in there. And so you mentioned others relying on it. And so the trustee who's representing the employees ultimately and the trust is trying to make a determination. Is your company going to be able to do what it says it's going to do? Is it believable that it can achieve what you predict its future to be? And the valuation firm that confirms that, at least the level of believability or reasonability, like, oh, I think that we can achieve this, or I think the company has the wherewithal to do that. It's going to change from company to company and from industry to industry. If you're running a machine shop, 3 shifts a day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week today, and you're producing X revenue and Y EBITDA, and your projections show that you're going to have a 20% year over increase in revenue and output, that's probably going to require more machines, maybe a new location. And I don't know that you can, if any of you have discovered how to add some extra hours to a day and throw in another shift on the existing machines, that would be great. But that might be unreasonable for someone to believe if you're operating at capacity today that you'll magically be able to get new, better margins tomorrow from the same series of machines for the same output for the same clients. So those items will show up and be tested throughout the process. And then management. I think management, it's going to look different in every company as well, but what targets are they given to hit? Are they operating targets? Are they financial targets? Or are they both? And what value does a forecast have for management? I think we'll probably get into this a little later, specifically around an ESOP transaction, but I don't want to leave them out of the concept or of the topic. How do
Yeah,
we get good at this? Oh, I'm sorry, Makenzie, I cut you off.
no, I was just gonna add, I think that's a good point, how you mentioned that management has certain KPIs or targets that they're trying to hit, and what is unique in a forecast is those targets that you're giving to whoever it is, your salespeople. That's not the same as the target that you're going to reflect in forecast. It may not be. Just because it's something that you want to hit does not mean that you can hit it, or that you're striving to hit. So understanding the difference between that those may not look the exact same, what you're telling your people to strive towards versus what you think you can reasonably actually hit. And then to your point, hitting those margins or those growth percentages and incorporating the other pieces that are required to hit that. So whether that's more people, whether it's more CapEx, etc.
So how do we get good at this? I imagine that there's a really terrible way of doing forecasting. And if I can imagine it, others can too. I'm just going to take what was there before. I'm going to, put my finger to the wind, and then I'm going to see, which way it's blowing, and go, all right, great. Feels like 15% every year. I think we can do that. I think there's probably a better way, but talk to us about that.
Yeah, I think the easiest way, there's different approaches to building a forecast, but I think the easiest way or easiest place to start is looking at your historical performance. Typically, I would say 5 years. I don't think you need to go more or beyond 5 years, but just starting with looking at your historical performance and using that as your baseline. Um, if you've never hit 200 million in revenue, what makes you think you're going to do that next year? How close have you been to 200 million before? What has your growth percentages looked like historically, and what were the drivers of that? So I would say just starting by looking at your historical performance and think through your revenue drivers, what has got you to where you are now, what does your labor and capacity look like, and then build off of that.
When would that not work well? When would historical performance be a poor indicator of what's ahead, do you think?
Good question. There could be a few things, but what immediately comes to mind is COVID. If COVID impacted your company and maybe it was a little bit of a lag, if it, for example, in the construction space, if it delayed jobs and it delayed for years after COVID, then maybe years that were negatively impacted and are not indicative of normal historical performance, you're not going to want to use that as your baseline. Or maybe there was just one year where you lost a really big customer or a big contract. Things that stick out that you know are kind of an anomaly, you wouldn't want to use that as your baseline.
Hmm.
On the other hand, if you are able to somewhat see in the future based on contracts that you have been awarded or things that you know for certain are in the pipeline, then that can contribute to you being able to defend and rationalize um, a better year than you've ever seen historically, if it's from due to factors that you know for certain are going to be there in the next year.
We recently did an episode on what could go wrong with an ESOP,
Mhm.
and inevitably the topic of value comes up, and the forecast itself. And I think we spend a good amount of time talking about the forecast there as well. Um, and an overly optimistic forecast can create a lot of turbulence after a transaction. And one of those, going back to how important is management in creating the forecast and their belief about its viability, is often a synthetic equity program is put in place that has performance targets based on the forecast that gets provided in the ESOP transaction. And if that doesn't hit, if the company doesn't hit those performance targets, then that synthetic equity, those stock appreciation rights or phantom equity, doesn't have any value. And so that program likely has the opposite effect of, instead of incentivizing people, of disincentivizing people by, great, I have more paper, but I have no way of being able to achieve the targets that I need to in order to make this paper worth something else of value.
Mhm. Yeah, that goes back to having a reasonable forecast with reasonable assumptions. And throughout the transaction process, it's important to be able to defend your assumptions, because in our role, we're giving you the expectation of what your value could be, but you do in an ESOP transaction go through negotiations and are speaking to a buy-side team who is going to beat up your forecasts and assumptions in the same ways that we intend to in the beginning of the process, and you need to be prepared for that. And another thing too is that for example, in the transaction year, if you're transacting in 2026, you start the transaction process early on, or at least exploring the transaction earlier on in the year. And so you have a full year forecast for 2026. However, as we're progressing throughout the year and the transaction has not yet closed, the buy side team wants to look at how you're trailing against that forecast based on actual performance as the year goes on. So that's an important piece too, is monitoring how your forecast, like how well you forecasted against your actual results as the year goes on.
I think that's a great point. And it gets back to that, having a discipline around forecasting or a habit around forecasting and not waiting until a transaction occurs, or you're contemplating a transaction for it to be the first time. It's okay if it is. It really is, listener. Don't want to dissuade you, but the earlier that you can adopt a mindset of really where are we headed and how do we think we're going to get there, and then put numbers to it, the better off you're going to be. What do you think is most useful? Like, what should you compare every line item of a P&L? Do you need to do pro forma balance sheets every month? Where should listeners focus if they decide to pick up the discipline of forecasting, Makenzie?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, if you are tracking it monthly, that's great. But maybe if you've never done it at all, starting with even just quarterly would be good. Um, in terms of tracking your forecast against actual performance. And I don't think it's necessary to focus on every single P&L line item, focus on your big buckets, obviously revenues and cost of revenues. And then in terms of SG&A, maybe it's salaries and marketing, etc. But you're not going to necessarily need to look at every single line item. Just look at what makes up the bulk of your expenses. Maybe once you get in the habit and you get great at forecasting, then you can get down to a very granular level, but I wouldn't say that's necessary. And that's also not what buyers are looking at. They're focusing on the bigger buckets, not the immaterial pieces.
Hmm. I like this list of questions for our contractor and contractor adjacent listeners. If you just want to roll through these one at a time, Makenzie, I think that would be really valuable in light of, thinking about what does growth look like for us as a construction company, as a builder, as a CMR. Like what are we doing? And how can we focus on getting to a more reasonable forecast?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we all know in the contractor world that backlog is it's a big thing, and like being able to distinguish. Well, one, having a backlog is great for forecasting because that gives you something to um, make assumptions on that is a little more concrete, but you still have to think about what happens when maybe the costs exceed what you initially projected, or maybe an awarded contract falls through, or maybe the timing gets delayed. So there is still some uncertainty, even though that you do have the privilege of creating a backlog through awarded contracts that start at a later time. Um, so you want to be able to evaluate the quality of your backlog and not just the list with the dollar amount that you're kind of banking on. What am I missing?
Just a moment where my mind was empty. Everyone gets to witness on this one. So, some of the things that you, again, contractors, listeners that are interested in forecasting, is asking yourself, like, does the existing backlog support this first year? How much into the future can you see with the way that your contracts are structured and your jobs are going? And then it really gives you a great base to start from, because if you know what year one looks like and what's going to trail into year two, now how much, what level of new award is needed for you to support the second year? And then is that consistent with your historical bookings? Does the company then have the labor to support the additional work that's required to meet that particular forecast? Does the company have the right bonding capacity to support that volume? What needs to change, if anything, there? And we talk a lot about the importance of working with our surety partners in advance of making a decision to move forward with the ESOP, because everybody has to be on board. Otherwise, the company can't do this. It'd be great to do 30% increase every year, but if you can't bond the jobs, then you're not going to increase by 30% every year, are you? What happens to working capital as revenue grows? And then finally, are projected margins consistent with the types of projects that you're pursuing? You know this, our contractor friends, better than anyone else, is that you can grow the top line as much as you want if you want to take jobs that don't make you any money and stress out the people that you have, and it's going to squeeze everything on the bottom line for the sake of the top. And if that's a deliberate growth strategy for a period of time, why you would do that or enter into that particular market, that's strategic. But growing the top line and then shrinking the margin on the bottom line is typically not a choice that you would want to make in perpetuity. So just things to think about.
Yeah, I think having, with all the uncertainty involved in forecasting, both in the context of contractors and any company in general. Another piece that we haven't discussed is having basically different versions of your forecast and do sensitivity analysis. So there's typically, we'll call it 3 different versions or cases of your forecast that you can have. You can have a base case, which is kind of middle of the road. You can have an like a downside case where it's worst case scenario, or maybe we're not going to have the base case year. Certain factors may prohibit you from getting there, or what does the opposite look like with a great year? So you have 3 different scenarios that you can use and not only use to assess which one is the most likely, but also see how each scenario can play into value and how they impact value.
I like that. And giving room to understand what would need to be true for us to experience the upside case. And then what would we do if we experience the downside case? What's the first decision that we're going to make if we move from what we expected to the worst case scenario? And that type of financial planning is really important, because those are questions that a valuation firm are going to ask. Like, what do we do in this scenario if you're off? Like, what can you do? And it allows you to think through those options ahead of time to say, here's what we would do. And now we understand the impact of how that would slow this getting worse, and for us to get ahead of whatever the circumstances are as best we can in order to get back on track to a base case or to an upside. So this is my favorite question. How useful is a tool that's always wrong, Makenzie?
It is still pretty useful. I think there's a difference of it being, I don't want to say always wrong, because it's not completely wrong, and that's the purpose of the forecast, is that you're not creating something that is completely unreasonable and unattainable. So it needs to be reasonable enough that it is still a useful tool, and it helps with decision making rather than just simply kind of predicting the future.
So if there's one thing that you want our listeners to remember, what would it be?
I would say if you've never prepared any forecast ever, really take the time to look at your historical performance and build your forecast based on true business drivers and what you've experienced through running the business, and not just desired outcomes. So kind of going back to that piece earlier, how maybe you're giving your salespeople certain targets that may not be exactly what you should reflect in your forecast, or maybe it is. But just knowing there's a big difference between desired outcomes versus what can you actually achieve.
I think that's really good advice. So the goal isn't necessarily to create a forecast that perfectly predicts the next 5 years, but more to create one that's reasonable enough for you to make decisions today, and then resilient enough for you that you can understand what happens when tomorrow looks different.
Mhm.
So, listeners, that's our weather report for the day on forecasting. I hope that this was valuable for you. If there's anything that we can do to help you, if you have other questions related to forecasting, for planning for a transition or for an exit, you need more detail, then reach out to us, and we are happy to interact with you in that regard. Like, subscribe, share this episode with a friend, and we will see you next time on the Journey to an ESOP and Beyond podcast. Thank you.
Thank you.